Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and while this is episode 40, I know it might not seem like much, but I think that's a pretty significant milestone for us here, and I want to thank every single one of you who follow, rate, and listen to the podcast. It is truly an ever-growing endeavor, and speaking of growing, if you want to help out the podcast even more, I have a ton of things I share on Patreon. I just added a monthly tarot reading on the first tier, but there's so much more like, further deep dives into folklore and magical techniques, recipes, building relationships with spirits, and even a spell or ritual that I put a lot of effort into curating and designing for you, all packaged up nicely. So, of course, the link will be listed in the show notes, but today I am going to be having the most fun rambling on about toads. This was one that has been on the back burner for a while now. Toads have a long, 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 long association with witches, sorcerers, and the occult. They just ooze enchantment, poison, and actually a lot of liminality with being amphibious creatures. They are of two worlds. They start their lives in water and transform into these little mud-dwelling creatures. They have an extremely rich history in folk magic, like lore and recipes, medicine across so many cultures. So, one of the greatest witches' allies, the one who blights fields, suckles upon the teat of the devil, and plays its impish little ways into the very ears of Christendom throughout their medieval mark on the world, especially. So, without further ado, let's just jump right into it. So first, the liminality. I want to start with talking about, the liminal features of this creature, and it is really quite the obvious with, them beginning as eggs to tadpoles to these little toadlets and finally their final form. Much like bats and snakes are very liminal, bats are almost this between land and sky, and snakes dwell beneath the surface but hunt and bask in the sun right on the very land that they retreat to. So toads engage in the very meaning of transformation. A transformation so intense they quite literally get suffocated out of the safety of the water which they once dwelled, starting, with gills that get covered by skin. Everything about their body is propelling them forward into this unstoppable stage of change. And it's ugly, it's harsh, and it's vulnerable. Their legs sprout out of seemingly nowhere that really seems anatomically correct. They just kind of pop out of the little tadpole body. And in addition to that, once they are adults, they go into this brumination stage when winter comes. So this hibernation. But with them it's called brumation. I'm sorry, not brumination. Brumation. But they descend. So they dig and burrow and they hibernate, actually reaching this low metabolic state where then they reemerge in the spring, very often looked at as dying and being reborn, naturally, gaining a connection to this more chthonic spirits and connection to the chthonic deities. So this little imp literally buries itself in the earth and stops. It heart rate drops dramatically. Its breathing slows. It's to almost nothing. For all intents and purposes, to really anyone watching, it looks dead. And then weeks or months later, it crawls back out. It begins its return before the new sciences, of course, and understandings that we have today and about, what it's really doing. The folklore of the toad dying and, being resurrected touched many cultures. It shaped many beliefs about this creature just on its own. It looks like a creature that has gone to the underworld and come back. And really, not just what it looked like, but where the fuck else would it go, especially to medieval minds of the people back then. Like it it just burrowed and disappeared and reemerged in the spring. Or not even, I don't even think many of them made the connection that they came out in the spring, but they would just flock back from underground in various numbers that were just jarring. So, really embracing being enveloped by the earth, right? That's what the toad does. This technique of enduring a descent, of actually burying oneself into this suffocating darkness while the world moves above you and just moves on for self preservation, but also to reemerge and continue another cycle of your life. So the very fact that just again, like plagues of them would reappear during certain seasons or even just rainstorms. Um, it inherently just belonged to sorcery. Toads have this reputation for themselves of being ugly, even if, thrown as a derogatory term at someone, they are really quite something else. I argue they're pretty cute, and many are very beautiful, but we cannot argue that a toad is on the same level as, say, looking like a tiger. It's not striking in the same way. It's covered in this sticky, damp skin, warty, wide set eyes, and a gaping mouth. It sits in the mud and it doesn't move and it watches you with these big golden eyes that just don't blink. But this ugliness, in my opinion, has its own connection to the chthonic spirits. They are a confrontation to disgust, which ultimately leads to a process of transformation for the witch and really further integration. Disgust it's an immediate reaction. This revulsion is an immediate reaction. If, that's what you feel when you look at a toad or any other jarring animal like insects and spiders and snakes, which I doubt many witches do, but the majority of the population. And really, if we are talking history here, it's not just if you liked or disliked an animal. It was about your community. It was about what was believed and what was said and what actually happened, just what was known. And toads were known to be dangerous to everyday life before we lived like this. Their appearance alone was used to symbolize moral decay, evil, and of course, association with our beloved little devil. And, toads were considered repulsive with poisonous skin and saliva, making them this natural mascot for witches, who were, of course, similarly depicted as haggard and sinister to evoke fear. But there's another dimension to the toad's liminality that sometimes gets overlooked, and that is actually the fact that its poison is also medicine. Because the toad doesn't just live between water and land, but has the capability for this poison to be capable of both life and death. It lives between healing and killing. Its skin secretes compounds, and I will save the pharmacology of that for later. But, I want to point out that the same secretions that can stop a human heart have also been used medicinally for centuries. In, of course, traditional Chinese medicine, dried toad venom, su, has been a pharmacopoeial ingredient for longer than Western medicine has existed as a discipline in general. Now, frog and toad toxins are used in a variety of ways for many treatments, even in modern medicine, or at least by synthesizing those specific chemicals within the toxin to produce modern pharmaceuticals. This is the same thing that we see with like foxglove and belladonna. It's the actual chemical that then gets synthesized and produced to be a synthetic version. But on the topic of between life and death, I want to talk about the Cambos ceremonies. And, I think in today's day, it might be exposed, at least through the internet, as more of not not like a woo-woo crystal, like I went to a cacao ceremony or I did ayahuasca. However, you know, I find when it comes to this ceremony in particularly what you find on the internet, I guess there's like some of those people who go into it from that point of view, but few dare within that space, at least from what I have seen, to go to such lengths of participating in the Cambo ceremony just for the novelty of it, because it's not that at all. And of course, traditional cacao ceremonies and ayahuasca, that's a different topic. That also has become pretty problematic. It's in its own right when it comes to the modernization of history. But, within the Cambo ceremonies, you can find videos and documentaries or even research papers further into this. But it's used traditionally within the tribes of the Amazon rainforest or basin. So this takes place in a group setting, often just called a Cambo ceremony. But in hindsight, without explaining everything, frog toxin is applied to a burn on the skin. And of course, absorb shortly after symptoms of tachycardia, vomiting, diarrhea, and I think even out of like 50 of the followed cases, 10 or more included extreme hallucinations and this psychedelic state. So while this stuff exists, there's also um, very heavily linked kidney damage, liver damage, seizures, even esophageal ruptures have happened, you know, and most of this damage leads to death. the point is, the ceremony, this very old folk remedy, is believed by practitioners and their respected tribes as aids to fertility, cleansing of the body and the soul, and even bringing luck to hunts. It has its applications in abortion, expelling bad spirits from people, and to even treat laziness. Now, to me, this is very liminal, inducing a state of between within the human body through suffering to get through to the other side changed, transformed. It's very visceral, it's very primal, very animal. It's like the typical horrendous werewolf transformations on TV. That's, I don't know exactly what I'm thinking of, but particularly American Werewolf in London. It's an 80s movie. If you know, you know. It's really good. But the scene where, he's changing for the first time is pretty intense. It's insane. It's like portrayed to be extremely painful. You can see his bones cracking and breaking, really, and hair coming out and his face changing. It's like turning inside out on yourself. And this toxin is just that, a toxin to induce a state of such weakness you are vulnerable enough for the transformation of your spirit to start. Now, this is the pharmacon of the toxin, the Greek concept of the substance that is, simultaneously remedy and poison. The dose makes the difference. And this is very akin to just witchcraft in itself, right? The very old tale as old as time, if a cunning person can heal, they can also curse. So the knowledge of that makes a difference. And that duality, that razor's edge between this cure and curse, is the essence of what it means to be the witch who can heal harms, and the witch who can bless curses. So the toad carries that duality in its skin, right? In the toxins. It sweats it, it oozes it, it uses it as a defense mechanism, and it is the living embodiment of the principle that power is not safe, that this specific medicine is not gentle, and that the things that save you and the things that destroy you are often the same thing in different doses. So, with that said, if we go into the historical associations of really how the toad became the witch's creature in the historical record, because there is such rich history here, and really it's everywhere, and of course I cannot cover them all, but I do want to start in Old English records because, the most familiar version of this story comes from the English witch trials, specifically the East Anglian trials of 1640s, the Matthew Hopkins era. So Hopkins was the self-appointed witch-finder general who terrorized between 1645 and I think like 47, and his methods included watching accused witches for their familiars, the imp spirits that were supposed to serve the witch and carry out her will. These familiars could take any form, like cats and dogs, mice, fleas, beetles, and of course toads. Now Hopkins' own pamphlet, The Discovery of Witches, focuses more on his methods than on specific depositions. And the surviving printed record doesn't always give us the verbatim testimony we'd want, right? But the broader trial culture of the period consistently includes amphibian familiars in the repertoire of these accusations. The toad familiar was recognized really as a very large type of familiar. It was expected when a witchfinder came looking for imps, toads were on the list, of course. And the dynamic of the toad familiar is worth admiring because the familiar was said to suckle from the witch's body, from a witch's mark, or the devil's teat, which was, of course, supposedly a supernumerary nipple, or a mole, or a skin tag, or basically any mark on the body that the witchfinder decided was suspicious. And, well, of course, for human bodies, there were a lot of these, quote, false teats found on bodies of the accused, but the image of the toad at the breast, that here is, I think, worth noting because the witch nurses this imp, feeding it from her own body. That image itself takes the most intimate, most nurturing act, a mother feeding her child, and almost inverts it on purpose. It calculates the way society saw a mother nurturing a child to the witch who feeds the demon. The woman like nourishes this monstrous thing, and the body that should sustain life instead sustains something from the other side. And it's an image of intimacy with the transgressive. And this toad, this cold, warty, ugly, poisonous little football thing, you know, is the perfect vessel for that inversion. You couldn't construct a more effective image of blasphemy for those times. Now, on the other hand, within some confessions is the other way around. So the toad would be fed, then milked itself, and its secretions and poison would be used in magic, especially malefic practices. So there was a relationship between the witch and her toad, no doubt. If the toad fed from the witch, from milk or even bloodletting, or if the witch fed from the toad, they were together. And perhaps, you know, if what the witch fed the toad had correspondence to the powers its poison then carried, they would keep this little imp on a very specific diet. And maybe, just maybe, this actually did affect the, well, effects that the poison had and how it inflicted the person. Now, when it comes to this imagery, there are a lot of illustrations that show toads at the feet of witches, toads being kissed in acts of diabolic homage, and toads as participants in this inverted ritual of the Sabbath, right? Visiting the Sabbath, being ridden to the Sabbath. If you go down the rabbit hole of browsing these woodcuts and drawings within these old texts, like the Discovery of Witches, the Compendium Maleficarum, even the Dictionary Infernal, and more, or just even artists like Charles Morand or Emily Bayard. Really, there are a lot of treasures here that you can find if you just spend hours digging. Another thing I want to mention that's very akin to that inverted image of, a witch um, feeding her imp or this demon. There is some documents from the Spanish Inquisition, more specifically records from Basque in the 17th century, which contain accounts of these dressed toads. Now, witches under the instruction of the devil dressed toads in velvet or cloth, these little miniature garments and these little outfits for the toad, and they would feed these dressed toads their own blood. To me, this is really like a parody of sacraments. The dress toad is a spoof of baptism because if you really think about it, you take a creature from the mud, a creature associated with poison and darkness and even the underworld, and you dress it, you clothe it in a way that you would maybe even clothe a child for christening. You give it garments, you give it dignity, you give it an outward sign of civilization and even Christianity, and then you feed it blood, which is blood, more importantly. It's very much like the Eucharist in the Mass. The faithful consume the blood of Christ in the Sabbath. The witch feeds her blood to the toad. The direction is just reversed. The sacred is inverted, and the toad dressed as it's like a little child in its little velvet coat kind of becomes this little antichrist figure, a baptized demon, if you will, a creature of the mud that has just been elevated to a mockery, more or less, of the sacred. And of course, like many of the records of magic and witchcraft we have today, whether any of this actually happened, you know, whether any actual person dressed a toad in velvet and fed it blood, it's almost besides the point. But what matters is that the inquisitors believed it, or at least they believed that it was believable. So yeah, I think my next mission in life is going to be finding a toad and, sewing and creating garments for it and dressing it, and um, we'll see where it goes from there. And on the topic of doing these little adventures with our toads, I must talk about the toad bone rite. So the ritual goes, as it's been recorded in folklore collections from East Anglia and surrounding regions. And, I want to be clear about some sources here. This comes primarily from the fieldwork of George Ewart Evans, who is someone who really spent decades collecting this oral history from rural communities in Suffolk and Norfolk in the mid 20th century, but it also appears in L.R. Haggard's The First Walked by Night, which was published in 1935, and it preserves local Norfolk stories. And the classical antecedent, the oldest written version of something like this ritual, goes all the way back to even Pliny the Elder in his Naturalis Historia, Book 32, specifically Chapter 18. But here's what you do. So you find a toad, or in some versions, you catch a very specific kind of toad, a natterjack. In some East Anglian accounts, you kill it. Some versions say you kill it at a specific time, a full moon or a new moon or even a saint's day. You take the body and you place it in an anthill and you leave it there. You leave it for the ants to do their work. They strip the flesh, they clean the bones, and this takes days, sometimes weeks, and you just wait for it to happen. When the skeleton is clean, when there's nothing left but just the bones, you collect them and then you take the bones to a running stream. It has to be running water, and some versions specify that it has to be at, midnight, maybe even a particular phase of the moon, and you take it to the place with the running water and you place them in the water because all the bones float downstream. That's just what bones do when they're in running water. They get carried by the current, all of them. But supposedly one stays, right? One bone floats upstream against the current, against the natural order. And that one bone defies the water and it moves in the direction that nothing should move. And that is revealed to be the toad bone. So the moment you take the bone from the water, something happens. And of course, descriptions vary, but they're consistent in their intensity. A rushing wind, a sound like screaming, or just something enormous moving through the trees, or even a sense of overwhelming dread and presence. I believe I kind of talked about this very guttural, deep feeling that like the wind has changed when we talked about the devil and the rites of meeting the witch's devil. But, overall, the witch will know that something has changed, that you have crossed this threshold. And the rules are absolute. You must not look behind you, you must not speak, you must not falter. You take the bone and you leave and you carry it with you. And from that moment forward, you are a toad man. So the primary and most widely attested use is power of this bone is over horses. The Toadman could calm any horse, could make a panicked, rearing, uncontrollable animal stand still with a word or a touch. Could also do the reverse, so make another man's horse refuse to move, refuse to work, or, refuse to obey anyone but the Toadman. And in a rural agricultural economy where horses were the primary source of motive power, where your livelihood actually depended on your ability to work with these animals, that kind of power and control was economic, it was social power, and that was the power to make yourself indispensable and to make your rivals even helpless. So the Toadmen of East Anglia were a recognized social category. They weren't witches in the dramatic demonological sense. They were working men, they were farm laborers, plowmen, horse handlers, and, they were known to possess this particular knowledge, and they were feared and respected in equal measure because the man who could calm your horse could, of course, also stop your horse. They had the power to do these two things. They very much held this liminal power. But the toad bone wasn't only about horses. It was about personal magnetism. So the ability to attract, to charm, to make people want to be near you, sexual attractiveness, the ability to command obedience, protection against malefic magic, against the evil eye, and misfortune just generally. Now, this rite is not just a spell, obviously. It really errs on the side of an initiation. The toad bone rite is not a recipe. It is an initiation. You go in as one thing and you come out as another. The bone is the proof that you crossed, and the bone is this mark of your transformation. It is the proof of power, and it carries not just the power of the bone itself, but what you went through to get it. Killing the toad a very specific way. First, going to the means of finding it, and then killing it in a very specific way, and then waiting for it to be decayed and devoured by these ants, and then collecting the bones, and then going to a stream, and then, you know, initiating it, and it's a whole thing. And I want to note, something about the social dimension of this, because this actually was more of a working class magic. This was not learned magic from books. This was not, something ceremonial that had to be performed in lodges by educated men in robes. This was the magic of the man who worked with their hands, who wanted to have power over these horses. I'm sure back then there was lots of reasons why, or even the other reasons, not just be able to control horses, but maybe to attract someone they've always had their sights on, or just overall control, to know something that nobody else knew. and carry the secret that made him more than what the world said he just was. So, other than the toad bone, there is also another precious piece of the toad called the toadstone, also known as buffonite. Medieval and early modern Europeans believed that toads carried a precious stone in their heads, not a metaphorical stone, but an actual physical gemstone hidden inside the skull of the toad. The stone was said to change color or sweat in the presence of poison. So it was worn as a ring or set in a brooch as, protection against poisoning and venomous bites. And, I still scour the internet for one of these, one day. It will happen. It will. I will get one. But even Shakespeare knew about it. As you like it, Act 2, Scene 1, and I quote, "Sweet are the uses of adversity, which, like the toad, ugly and venomous, wears yet a precious jewel in its head." End quote. Now, what were toadstones actually? Most of the objects sold as toadstones in the medieval and early modern gem trade were fossilized fish teeth, specifically from lepidotes, a Mesozoic ray finned fish. So the rounded button like shape of these fossils looked like what people imagined a stone from a toad's head might look like. And of course, the commerce of this was very real. Toadstones were set in rings mounted in those brooches and sold by apothecaries and jewelers across Europe. People paid real money for them, just like they paid for real unicorn horns, but they were just narwhal tusks. Either way, people wore them with genuine confidence that they would detect poison. And back then, being scared of being poisoned by someone was very, very real. While it's been debunked now for quite a long time, the principle is still very rich. The idea that something beautiful and precious is hidden inside something ugly and repulsive, that is profound magical and even alchemical concept because it's the prima materia, the base, a despised substance that contains the seed of gold. And in alchemical terms, the toad is the negrito, the blackening, the putrefaction stage, the phase of the work where everything looks ruined and hopeless and disgusting. And inside that blackening is that putrefaction, is the jewel, philosopher's stone, the thing that you're actually looking for. So it urges you, if we look deeper, to not look away from the ugly thing. The power is inside the ugliness. The jewel is inside the head of the toad, not the crown of the king. The treasure is hidden in the place that you least want to look. You have to reach your hand in the mud and grab that toad. And, I think that the principle extends far beyond toadstones. It's one of the most important things that magic has to teach us. The things that we find repulsive, the things that we want to turn away from, that make us uncomfortable, those are often the things that contain the most power, the shadow, the taboo. So, amphibian parts also appear in the PGM in spells for binding, for revealing thieves, for transformation, and for sympathetic action. Frog tongues show up in binding and identification spells. The PGM doesn't make the modern distinction between frogs and toads. The uses are consistent with the broader magical logic that, we've been discussing. Amphibian parts for transformation, for crossing these boundaries, and for binding and revealing. The amphibian is a creature of metamorphosis, and that's really the crux of it. And its parts carry that metamorphic power into the working. And then, of course, there's Pliny, Pliny the Elder. I mentioned that earlier in his Naturalis Historia. It contains extensive discussion of toad properties, like medicinal uses, even the toad bone tradition. Pliny is the oldest written source for something resembling the toad bone rite. He describes toad bones and their supposed properties with the same matter-of-fact tone that he uses for everything else in his Encyclopedia of the Natural World. So the classical world treated the toad as what it is, a potent creature with real properties that could be harnessed by someone who knew what they were doing. The medieval transformation of the toad into a creature of the devil is a theological project. Just as I mentioned, the toad representing Negrito and alchemy, the phase where the base substance that the alchemist is working to transform breaks down completely. It rots, it blackens, it becomes the most despised, most disgusting version of itself. It's a necessary and it's a required stage. You cannot reach the gold without passing through the black. So the toad is the emblem of that stage. It's squat, dark, and ugly, and sits in the mud of its own decomposition. And inside it, of course, the seed of gold. Now, there's a common alchemical emblem that pairs the toad with the eagle. The toad represents earth, body, the chthonic, the material, and the eagle represents air. spirit and the celestial and the transcendent. The union of these opposites, the marriage of the toad and the eagle, of earth and sky, produces the philosopher's stone. The transformation is complete only when the lowest and the highest are brought together. Now, another pairing is the toad and the rose. This is corruption and beauty, death and rebirth, the ugly vessel that contains the precious substance. This is the same principle as the toadstone, the jewel in the ugly head, expressed in alchemical visual language. Now, talking about visual language, in the Grimoire of the Golden Toad by Andrew Chumbly, he treats the toad as a living magical reality, a creature with its own spiritual authority and its own initiatory power, really its own place in the ecology of the unseen world. And then there's also the Frog Prince. Of course, we have to talk about the Frog Prince. Brothers Grimm, the enchanted prince trapped in amphibian form. And the thing that most people don't know or fail to recognize is that in the original version, the princess, of course, doesn't kiss the frog. She throws it against the wall. And, the transformation happens through violence, through the shattering of the ugly form, through the destruction of the appearance that conceals the truth. So it's not gentle. The Negrito must be shattered for the gold to emerge. The toad must be broken for the prince to appear. So this ugly form has to go through a stage of being destroyed, not gently. It's very violent and it's decisive for the transformation to occur, kind of like how I mentioned the transformation of the toad itself being from this cute little egg and this tadpole stage, uh, almost like a werewolf being transformed. It's not fun and it's rough. Things are growing out of places where things don't usually grow. But if we finally want to talk about the pharmacology of these poisons and these medicines and even flying ointments when it comes to toads, this is where, it goes from folklore to maybe even a little bit of hard science. So, toad skin, specifically the parotoid glands, those, big bumpy glands behind the eyes, secretes a cocktail of bioactive compounds that would make a pharmaceutical chemist's eyes water. They are two main ingredients, or categories, I should say. I said ingredients. Oh well, which I did mention a little bit earlier. So, the first category is the bufodienolides, which are these steroidal compounds that act like, cardiac glycosides. So there's actually some heart medication that is derived from the toxins of foxglove, medications like digoxin. So it has these effects of, the sodium potassium pump in cardiac cells. So in therapeutic doses, they can regulate heart rhythm, but in toxic doses, they cause arrhythmia and, of course, cardiac arrest. Now, bufotoxin, the general term for the toxic secretion, contains these compounds in concentrations that can absolutely kill a human being, and it does happen. But there's also a second category here of toxins within the secretions of the toad. Now, I'm not going to get too far into the super sciencey stuff, but basically, there is a very strong compound that is structurally related to DMT, one of the most potent psychedelic compounds known to science. Now, this chemical related to DMT is produced within the toxin bufotenine, and that is a psychoactive. Some toads actually secrete this, not all, but it produces altered states of consciousness and visual disturbances, dissociation, and in some reports, of course, out of body experiences. Now, the point of me mentioning all these chemicals and these toxins and how they work is really the flying ointment, the witch's salve. It is one of the most persistent and most debated elements of early modern witchcraft, and we hear many people talk about it. Which I love to talk about it. The claim repeated across demonological literature and trial records was that witches used an ointment applied to the skin or to a broomstick or to mucous membranes, and it enabled them to fly to the Sabbath spiritually, to leave their bodies. That's really the crux of it. So, the ingredient commonly cited in the historical sources include things like belladonna, henbane, mandrake, wolfsbane, all plants containing tropane alkaloids or other compounds that produce dissociative, hallucinatory, and even paralytic effects when absorbed through the skin. And some sources include animal fats as the carrier base, the medium that would allow the plant compounds to be absorbed transdermally because, you know, I think it's soluble or non-soluble fats. The structure of the fat within the animal is very similar to structure of our skin, so they basically speak the same language, and it's able to um, produce its effects that way when it's applied topically. But some sources specifically mention toad. The Magia Naturalis gives some of the most detailed early modern depiction of these solves. The author Giovanni describes preparations that produce numbness, paralysis, and what he calls deep sleep accompanied by vivid visions. So he's writing from a very natural philosophy perspective, not this demonological one for the sole purpose of terrifying the public of witches and witchcraft. He's interested in how these things work, and his descriptions are consistent with what we know now about the pharmacology of the ingredients that he lists. So there's an honest caveat here, and it is explicitly the mention of toad secretions, which is named, printed flying ointment recipes is relatively rare. The association between toads and flying ointments is partly historical, partly inferential, and really based on the known pharmacology. So we know that toad secretions contain these psychoactive compounds. We know that those compounds can produce experiences of flight and dissociation. We know that toads were associated with witches and with ointments in the popular imagination. And, we don't have a recipe that outwardly just says take one toad, squeeze its glands, and mix with henbane and apply to your broomstick. But what we do have is the pharmacological plausibility, just us putting two and two together with the little crumbs that we do have. And I think that also speaks to the way that we have modernized witchcraft so much today. We don't actually truly know most of the details of how things were done and practiced. We actually just make these educated guesses, and with modern ingredients and applications, we just sort of recreate what we want to say is the witchcraft of old. Something so true and untouched by religion and anything else, and it's before Christianity, but really most of that is close to impossible. It will nearly always be a recreation of what we think we know, unless you're someone who is just entirely blessed by oral tradition, and there is no room for much nuance within your own family tradition or what you practice. So with the folk belief that toads were ingredients in witches' ointments was so widespread and persistent, and of course the pharmacology that we know now supports the possibility that something like that could have worked. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Some practitioners probably did use toad derived preparations, alone or in combination with plant materials. The knowledge of toad secretions effects was widespread enough that it would be strange if no one really ever experimented with it. But the specific standardized flying ointment recipe with toad that some modern writers present as historical fact is probably just more of a reconstruction than a documentation. Now, on the subject of medicine and healing when it comes to toads, there were actually something called toad doctors. Now, if you have not heard of this before, you are probably like, "Okay, this isn't real. You're you're just putting the word toad in front of everything." But I swear it's real. They were itinerant healers, so they were traveling practitioners who used live toads, dried toad parts, and toad-derived preparations to treat illnesses. Methods were very direct, placing a live toad in a bag around a patient's neck. The toad was supposed to draw out the illness to absorb into its own body, rubbing a dried toad on the affected area, selling toad leg amulets at fairs and markets for protection against specific diseases, particularly scrofula, the king's evil, a form of tuberculosis that affects the lymph nodes of the neck. There's an obvious response to this, especially today, and that is just the pure weird as superstitions of people of the early modern period and medieval periods. But with what we know about toads now, maybe, it actually did help a little bit. Of course, the toad skin secretions do have documented anti inflammatory and antimicrobial properties. A preparation derived from toad secretions applied to an inflamed or infected area could plausibly have had actually some therapeutic effect. The toad doctors may not actually have understood this mechanism, but their observation that the toad derived preparations could affect illness was not wrong. It was arrived at through a different epistemology, I guess, through centuries of, observation rather than a sort of controlled clinical trial. But the observation itself was accurate. Then, of course, the placebo effect. As a general topic of discussion within the magic sphere, I think some people are comfortable talking about the placebo effects in magic, and some people are not. I err on the side if it works, it works. Maybe that is more of a chaos magician approach, or but if there's no harm, no foul, if you get what you want, then is it really worth trying to debunk the power it held either way? So, a patient who believes they are being treated by someone with specialized knowledge, using materials with recognized power in a ritual context that engages their attention and their hope, that patient's body responds. We know this. Modern medicine knows this. And the toad doctor's ritual, the specific materials, the specific gestures and words, created a therapeutic context that engaged the patient's own healing capacity. And finally, the toad doctor occupied a social role that we've largely lost. They were the person who was willing to handle what others wouldn't touch. They were the person who knew the ugly creature, who understood its properties, who could work with it even when everyone else recoiled. And that willingness to engage with the repulsive, the dangerous, and the liminal was itself a form of authority. That's the same authority that the witch or the cunning person carries. Someone who is willing to go to that dark place, to handle the difficult material, to work with forces that polite society would rather pretend don't exist. The toad doctor's power came from the same source as the toad's power, the willingness to exist at this threshold, to be between medicine and magic, between the respectable and the transgressive, between the clean and the unclean. The toad doctor was a liminal practitioner working with a liminal creature, and the combination was effective precisely because of that liminality. And maybe, that's just me reading way too far into it, but it is what it is. Beyond the toad doctor specifically, toad remedies were widespread across European folk medicine. Of course, dried toads were worn as amulets against plague and fever, documented across England, France, and Germany, and even Italy. Toad ashes mixed into poultices for skin conditions, live toads even placed on wounds or swellings with the belief that the toad would draw out the illness. I feel like there's also a story of like finding out if you're pregnant to pee on a toad or I don't know, something of that nature, I think I've heard before. But there are even toad derived preparations for love magic, specific bones, particularly from the left side in some regional variants, said to reconcile lovers or inspire desire. I actually have a cane toad coin purse from my best friend who was deployed in Guam, but he was explaining to me that they are highly invasive over there and of course poisonous, but it was nothing less than expected. I feel very rich in life when there are moments, the people who are close to me find quote weird little oddities and think of me. Plus, I love pulling it out in public when I need to get the exact change out. So before we move into some practical work, I want to spend another moment on toad taboos because, they tell us something important about how people actually treated or related to this creature in their daily lives, not in the dramatic context of witch trials and Sabbaths, but in the ordinary context of, just the garden in the field. Across European folk traditions, killing a toad was considered very unlucky, not just mildly unfortunate, but genuinely dangerous. It could bring poor harvests, it could bring illness to your livestock, it could attract the attention of witches. If there was a toad in your garden, you were expected to just basically leave it alone. Personally, I would rather befriend it. The time I actually did have a toad in my garden, which is actually very unexpectedly, since, I have all potted plants and a concrete patio, but he found his little home underneath my dog's bed in the mud, very well protected. And I kept his mud moist when I watered the plants, and he stayed a few weeks and then descended into the very hole that he stayed in. But when it came to, understanding these taboos, they of course came from somewhere. All that talk and just genuine understanding of the toad being a very malefic creature, the toad might actually be the witch's familiar, the one that you found in your garden. It might be someone's actual familiar within your own village. Killing it could mean harming the witch. The witch would know, and the witch would retaliate, and now you're targeted. It was way less of a fuck this witch, I'm gonna kill her toad, and more don't mess with things that belong to someone way more powerful than you. But then there was the dilemma of the toad might actually be a witch in transformed shape. Killing it could be murder. And again, not just like a murder of, oh, I murdered a toad. No, it was like the belief in shape shifting was so strong, so real that the idea that witches could take animal form, in that the animals you encountered might not be what they appeared to be, could mean if you kill the wrong toad, spider, bat, or cat, you would have committed murder against another person. Other than the toad just being generally recognized as this liminal creature, perhaps killing it could disrupt balance in some way. Really, the toad is just useful. It eats insects, it indicates the health of the land, and it carries medicinal properties, so killing it was just wasteful. Toad omens were also very widespread, so, a toad crossing your path could be read as a sign. The direction it came from, the time of day, the circumstances of the encounter all mattered. A toad entering your house was variously interpreted as a sign of coming rain, a visit from the dead, or a warning of change. And of course, the toads appearing in unusual numbers meant something was stirring. Something in the unseen world was active, was moving, was paying attention, or just spring when brumation has ended. But the toad's song, too, that low rhythmic calling at dusk, was considered prophetic in some traditions. The toad speaks at the threshold time, at the boundary between day and night. So, finally, if you do want to work with toad materia in some way, I will refer you to maybe my episode on animal material in general for educational purposes only. It is important to mention all material used or gathered should always be ethically available to you from sourcing or any other means if someone were to engage in using parts of toads for magical purposes, hypothetically speaking. But talking about the reality that many amphibian species are in serious decline globally is important. Habitat loss, climate change, even fungus and pollution. Amphibians are among the most threatened groups of animals on the planet, and in many jurisdictions, there are legal protections for amphibian species. Working with live toads or harvesting from wild populations is ethically and often legally problematic. Now, I am someone who loves to touch and pick things up when I am out in the wilderness, but just be mindful that frogs and toads and other amphibians do tend to even breathe through their skin. So, touching them is not always the smartest thing for their own protection. But other than working with tangible remains, you, of course, can work with toads as any other animal in spirit form within symbolism. You do not need a physical toad to benefit from this little warty creature. The toad as a spirit ally, a guide to threshold spaces, to the medicine poison boundary, to the power hidden in ugly or despised things, is available through meditation, through journey work, through visualization, through even dream incubation. And you can work with toad imagery, toad shaped amulets, carved or sculpted toad figures. The energy is really accessible without the body. And of course, adapt the historical recipes. You can use the structure of the traditional workings, like the toad bone rite, and of course, amulets and preparations with ethical substitutions, though always recognizing where it is coming from. Ceramic or carved toad bones instead of, actual bones. You can go as far as making your own. Symbolic stream rituals instead of literal ones, visualization based versions of the Midnight Vigil. The initiatory structure of the toad bone rite can be adapted into a powerful personal ritual without actually requiring the death of an actual toad. And then there's the simplest and perhaps the most powerful practice of all. That's just cultivating a relationship with toads in your environment. If you have a garden, make it toad friendly, create habitat, leave areas of damp, dark shelter, don't use pesticides, and welcome the toad into the space. The toad that lives in your garden is a guardian, whether you formalize the relationship or not. But if you do formalize it, acknowledge its presence, speak to it, leave it offerings or water or shelter. You're entering into this newfound relationship with a creature that has been in relationship with the witch itself for thousands of years. So, if you choose to engage with the toad on a more spiritual level through meditation or trance work, the toad is a guide to the underground, to the hidden, to the buried, the things that you've pushed away or turned down. It is, an excellent ally when you're doing shadow work. If you're trying to access something that you've been avoiding, the toad is perfect. It lives in the dark, it's comfortable there, even asking the toad to devour things whole. Now, there is a traditional belief within the Cherokee that I have heard of the giant frog who attempts to eat the sun or the moon during an eclipse. And then lots of noise is made to scare it away or cause it to spit it out. And there's a similar folk belief in Vietnamese and Laotian legend. A giant toad or frog is believed to swallow the sun, causing the sky to go dark. But this really gets me thinking of this very real thing. If you ever watch a toad or a frog eat, it's actually pretty intense. Their mouths are huge and gaping, and it could be asked of the toad to swallow many things for the witch. So, as I wrap things up about the toad, back to the image I started with, this warty, cold, low to the ground, half buried in the mud, watching you with gold eyes that don't blink. So, the toad has been with us for a long, long time, as long as we've been practicing magic. was in the Greek magician's spell kit, a frog's tongue dried and wrapped in linen, tucked into a binding spell. It was in the cunning woman's garden, a living presence at the threshold, a guardian that ate the insects and watched the door. And it was in the horseman's pocket, a single bone, carried in secret, giving him power over creatures 10 times his size. And it was, of course, the alchemist's emblem. It was the Negrito, the blackening, the ugly stage that contains the seed of gold. And still here, still sitting in the dark, just brooding and watching, carrying poison and medicine in the same skin and between two worlds of healing and cursing, burrowing beneath the earth like a muddy little wet imp. you know, the toad's purpose is not to be beautiful, but I really think it's to be shocking, to be this rich vial of medicine in more ways than one for, the witch who seeks its effects, doing what it's always done, carrying the jewel inside of its ugly little square head and sweating these toxins from the same glands, dying every winter and coming back every spring. The toad is a wonderful ally to work with. To me, it's less of a creature to embody, but it shows up as omens, as markers for the witch when it needs to, and very, very important ally within the actual material craft itself. And I want to thank everyone who has listened today. Thank you for returning, or if you are new here, I hope you do return. And as always, I sincerely wish this episode sparked at least something of usefulness for you in your own craft, wherever you are in the world. I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.